Episode 147 of the Interpretation Station is Call to Order. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. How are we all doing? Today's episode is a special episode for those of you with Russian in your combination. I've been a bit quiet on the Russian front. I noticed the last few episodes, so we've got I've taken a couple of Russian statements here today from the Human Rights Council, which is ongoing. This is the current session. 3 weeks into it so far. Last week coming up the last week, so it's been quite hard work. Pretty obviously some quite divisive themes under discussion. So I've taken a couple of quite juicy Russian rants, shall we say, from this session to look at. One is it's a right of reply. We'll do first. It's a right of reply during the general debate under item 4 and. Relates to the situation in Ukraine. The other one similar. The second one we'll do. It was a thematic debate or a thematic discussion on the negative impact of colonialism on human rights. So there again, the issue of contemporary issues in Europe also feature quite prominently. So there's some really good vocab in both of them. That's why I decided that we would do those. So again, I'll leave the links to those texts in the description box for you, so that you can practice them. And then after you've practiced them, recorded yourself, come and watch the show and see if there's any new tricks that I can perhaps teach you. So we won't, without any further ado, as they like to say, no more beating around the bush. Let's get straight down to it. We'll start off with the right of reply, which was from the 27th of September. So I'll share the screen with you now. Okay, so here we go. Then this is the right of reply. As you can see, statement by the representative of the Russian Federation at the 51st session of the Human Rights Council в рамках права на ответ. So, right to reply, права на ответ. В ходе общей дискуссии по пункту 4. So they call it the general debate, not the general discussion. Also, I think at the General Assembly, sometimes when they have the general debate, I've heard общая дискуссия, общее прение. General debate, you generally want it to play safe, okay? And so we'll just go through it. Mr. President, Human Rights Council, always a president, okay. We're forced to exercise our right of reply following the statements by the delegations of the EU, the US, and a number of other countries. So it's always good to know your set vocabulary. This is a very procedural thing that they will say, and it's something that will be used frequently, in all these general debates, especially when there are so many divisive issues going on. There's going to be so many rights of reply. Armenia versus Azerbaijan, North Korea versus South Korea, and Japan. There's so many of these little squabbles going on that no matter what the issue that's being covered, no matter what the issue is at stake, it's all likely to descend into a sort of, at the end of the meeting, it's all likely to descend into a tit for tat, rights of reply, finger pointing, and so on. So it's important to know how to say this. We're forced to exercise our right of reply for Vospolzovats. Okay, exercise a right of reply following the statements by the delegations of the EU, the US, and a number of other countries. В очередной раз, yet again, there's always a sense of frustration when they say, в очередной раз. It's not just to get, once more. It's, yet again. Услышали порцию инсинуаций. We've heard порция, portion. We wouldn't really say a portion of insinuations. I think in English we're more likely to say something. We've heard a string or a slew of insinuations. By the way, I'm going to do at the end of this, I'll also do a site translation once I've been through it once, just to give you an idea of how I would sort of react in real time without having the chance to think about it, what I'm interpreting. A string of insinuations against the regarding Russian actions in Ukraine. We'd like to ask them Где хваленая принципиальность? So I think I would say here perhaps where are their vaunted principles? I mean, we don't really have this word, this principialness. We don't really have a word, principality, do we? I think you have to turn this into a noun and say хваленая, they're much vaunted, they're vaunted principles. And by the way, this was going extremely fast. I should point out that this was going extremely fast. I think we did have the text before us, but again, there were certain troubles with the Russian delegations. There have been during this session of the council. There was a complaint at one point. They hadn't submitted their text for one of their statements, and they started questioning whether the interpretation was correct. They put in a complaint, and everything was fine. Actually, the interpreter had done a perfectly good job. But there's a real tension now in the room. You can feel whenever Russia speaks, and if they don't, and particularly if you don't have the text. I mean, you've got to be so accurate. Okay. So the much vaunted principles on issues of protection of the rights, всех без исключения лиц. That's this kind of thing they say all the time. Всех без исключения. Maybe you could say of all persons bar none. They often talk about все страны без исключения, all countries bar none. Or maybe here the protection of each and every person is another way of doing it here. That they are forever ratuju, that they're forever advocating for, that they're forever championing. To champion and to advocate are good synonyms, okay, for causes, all right? To champion something, to advocate for something. Has anybody ever heard them condemn Kiev for за удары по гражданскому населению, for striking, for attacking the civilian population, or to be honest, I would be just tempted to say to strike civilians. If you didn't have the text in front of you, just to save yourself a word, their strikes, their attacks on civilians. Где призывы? Where are the calls to Zelensky соблюдать международное гуманитарное право? To observe IHL would be the quickest way of doing that. Just use the acronym straight away for international humanitarian law. I think that in English the best collocation is to observe. Or you can just, but you can also say to respect, to comply with. So where are the calls on Zelensky to observe IHL and not torture or kill prisoners? Okay, that torture. Now this next sentence is a bit tricky. So literally, if you go word by word, to not fire from their Western weapons on peaceful people, formerly inhabitants of Ukraine. Okay, so you could say it that way. Maybe it sounds better English to say not to use their Western weaponry against мирным людям, peaceful people. Again, you could just say civilians, I think, here. Некогда жителям Украины, formerly citizens, former residents of Ukraine. I guess they consider those parts now. I guess they consider those parts of Ukraine now to be officially part of Russia following these referendums they've just had. No one has said a word of сочувствия, of compassion, of sympathy for the loved ones of the hundreds of children who've died at the hands of Ukrainian soldiers, of Ukrainian military. They have been silent. They've stood silent is maybe the best, highest register way we'd say that in English, and covered up for покрывали киевских нацистов, начиная с 2014 года. So maybe they've stood silent and have been covering for the Kiev Nazis starting in 2014, and they continue to do so now. В этом зале, so in this chamber, okay, for that could, just always say for zal, just the chamber, is in the room, tend to say chamber. In this chamber, the delegations of the Western countries, maybe you could just say of the West, as I say, your time is an absolute premium doing this statement. You listen to the recording, you hear how fast the guy is speaking, you want to condense everything as much as you can. So you could maybe say the delegations of the West have hypocritically Рассуждаем. I like to use musing, like a poet, like a philosopher. I think that's the idea, okay? Have hypocritically mused as to the illegitimacy of the referendums na osvobожденных territory. I would say on the liberated territories, as opposed to freed. I think when you talk about land, you talk about liberating land on liberated territories. However, своим безразличием, okay, a couple of good solutions here for безразличие, their disdain or their scorn for the судьбам, okay, literally for the fates. Maybe you'd say in English we talk about their plight. We often know about people's plight, but again, no one could fault you, I think, if you just said fate. Their scorn for the fate of their residents left them no choice. So I got a feeling some of this was maybe written quite quickly. There's a couple of weird grammatical things that sometimes these sentences in the Russian don't quite read that smoothly. Obviously, they're saying that the Ukrainians authorities' disdain for the situation of the residents left those residents with no other choice. People there no longer want to live in permanent fear of перед озверевшими украинскими националистами. So this is a word that comes up a lot, озверевший, and it's okay. They're becoming beastly, they've turned beastly. Zvier is the root of that word. But I've always wondered, what's the best way of putting that into English? And it occurred to me, this is my idea, okay? Maybe you like it, maybe not. Maybe you've got a better version. Fanatical, okay? In permanent fear of fanatical Ukrainian nationalists. They no longer want to ставить под угрозу. You can just do all that. And they no longer want to jeopardize the future of their children, or put at risk the future of their children. Ставить под угрозу. Но западным менторам на это в общем-то наплевать. That seems quite a sort of slangy way. Наплевать sounds, I mean, maybe Russian natives, can you tell me if that's quite low register, that seems to me. Anyway, but their Western mentors couldn't care less, I think would be the best way of rendering that in English. I was thinking, as I say, наплевать, pretty low register. Their Western mentors couldn't give a damn. Would that be a good reflection of that, наплевать? It's не случайно, it's no accident. That's a good, they always say that. It's no accident, it's no coincidence that their leaders state directly that for them the main goal is to во что бы то ни стало победить Россию, is to defeat Russia at all costs. Для этого все средства хорошие. So I think they will stop at nothing. Even, all means are good. I mean, would they stop you if you said that? Sounds a bit weird in English. I think the best way to render that is they will stop at nothing to do that. They try and упрекать, admonish us. They try and reproach us about the situation in our country. I think they're talking here внутри страны, they talk about in Russia. Беспринципность. Again, they like these things to do with принципиальность, беспринципность. I think you have to say lack of principles. This lack of principles is no surprise. I guess you could say, is it hypocrisy? That is hypocrisy, right? I'm wondering if that's too much of a leap to say. Again, remember, your main client, when you're interpreting from Russian into English, it does tend to be the Russian delegation. So I think you play safe and say perhaps this lack of principles is no surprise. Only the countries of the EU, the US, их последователи. So with последователи, I was thinking about this one. I guess the most straightforward solution would be their followers. So, there's definitely a kind of derogatory tone to that. I think I'm wondering if you could say here their adherents, their acolytes. So if you want to, again, maybe you want to just play safe. Maybe it's best just to play safe, just their followers. But again, you want to have some of these words for these rather pejorative ideas of they're just blind, of a group of people blindly following the leader, which is why I sort of I'm putting out those words, those ideas of adherents, or what else did I say? Or acolytes, they're minions. If you think it's too strong in this context, then just play safe and go with follower. I think it is possible высокомерно учить жизни другие государства. So высокомерно, like, is haughtily. Okay, if you're gonna render высокомерно word for word, condescendingly. That's a lot of things. That's a condescendingly 5 syllables, haughtily 3 syllables. I mean, what he's basically saying, I think it's possible to lecture other states on how to live their lives. I think, to lecture, that's another theme that is often prominent when the Russians are having a go at the West, on telling them how they lecture other countries on how they should conduct themselves. So, and it's maybe you could say, and their followers think it's possible to lecture other states how to live. So anyway, I'll give you. There's a few ideas. So for высокомерно, haughtily, condescendingly, or again have this idea of lecturing. Stop, like a teenager telling the parents, stop lecturing me. That's the idea, right? And at the same time, на протяжении многих месяцев, for many months, methodically stifle все основы, all the foundations of freedom of expression, свободы выражения мнения. That's just freedom of expression. You don't have to say freedom of expression of opinion, just freedom of expression. Restricting and banning the work of more than 100 SME, media, for example, in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and the Czech Republic, or Czechia. There's a lot of people, nowadays calling that country Czechia, and I guess it's Czechia, 3 syllables, Czech Republic. Somehow Czechia is quicker to say. And you're spared having to get... I often, when you hear Litva, that always is one that throws me. Is it Lithuania? Is it Latvia? Obviously, it's Lithuania, but just be careful of what Litva. So Latvia, just think Lithuania. In this chamber, they try and criticize our internal legislation on so-called foreign agents. I think I will surprise many of you, maybe even the US delegation itself, if I tell you that положение нашего закона, the provisions of our law, are in many ways позаимствованы, are borrowed from the аналогичного, the corresponding, a similar American legislation, которая действует вот уже почти 100 лет, which has been in force, which has been in effect for almost 100 years. The only difference being that in the US, оно даже жестче. Okay, it's tougher. In the US, it's even tougher. For example, его нарушение, violating it, карается вплоть до тюремного заключения. Okay, so this is a kind of important syntax, terminology to know, because it'll come up, particularly when you're doing anything to do with law enforcement, committees to do with prisons, law enforcement, talking about how a crime carries a sentence of, a crime is punishable by, that sort of idea. So here you could say, violation of it carries a prison sentence, вплоть до, карается вплоть до, even carries a prison sentence of up to 5 years, is punishable up to 5 years imprisonment, of which in Russia, for поминение, there is no mention. For поминение, there's no mention. In Australian legislation on the activities of foreign agents, относится посты. Well, if you've already started the sentence with the in, okay, you have to adapt a bit. You have to say something like, in Australian legislation on activities of foreign agents, this covers posts, communication on social networks, and even musical streaming. So I will often, when I hear the в докладе, в законе, I'll often turn that locative into the subject of the sentence, just drop the verb and say Australian legislation on the activities of foreign agents, and that way just относится, you just turn that into an includes or refers to posts, to communications or to общение, to messages on social networks and even to musical streaming. Из уст официальных лиц Великобритании is so maybe you could just say officials from the UK and Estonia периодически проскакивает. Periodically, so I said I think let slip their intention. Officials from UK and Estonia periodically let slip their intention to adopt their own law on foreign agents. I think that let slip kind of replicates quite nicely the image perhaps that the speaker is trying to convey here. So maybe it is time for the council to carefully look at this initiative and also to treat this initiative and to send to Washington and Canberra недвусмысленно. You always have two synonyms. There's a categorical or unambiguous signal of the need to review their own internal legislation. Дополняют картину. This is quite interesting. The idea is basically we've said all that, and now on top of that, now that's what I actually went for. Okay, I said on top of all that, you have. Now, one idea I had and my booth partner at the time was we both had the idea of the icing on the cake. Okay, except that I held back from doing that again because once again you got the Russian listening into it, and he might not know that idiom. Okay, in English. And he might just think, what on earth is the interpreter talking about? So again, you got to make that exception kind of with when the Russians or delegation, other delegations can be like that, I'm sure. But you think, they're listening, the ambassador is listening in, or the minion of the ambassador is listening in, and if he hears you talking about icing on a cake and he's never heard that idiom used before, he might have a heart attack. So again, sometimes it's better just to play it more straight down the line and just say, on top of all that, you have. Now, you have to throw in the you have, or there is, оголтелая Russophobia, rabid Russophobia, rampant Russophobia. Okay, I think they're two good synonyms again. They all both start with ra, rabid, rampant. Ненавистнические заявления, hateful statements and actions, repression against national and linguistic minorities. Эти явления вернулись. These phenomena are back and are now широко распространены, and are now widespread in contemporary and modern day Europe. Мы принципиально выступаем против. Again, this is something you say all the time. The Russians are obviously, as you can, they're fundamentally against a lot of stuff going on at the UN these days. So again, we're fundamentally against. We fundamentally oppose. Выступаем против страновых мандатов, country mandates. But clearly the situation in the EU and overall in the collective West, I think you could just drop in the prostra, okay, requires the urgent attention of the Council. I thank you. So again, I'll do a quick run through of that, okay? Very quick side translation. President will first exercise our right of reply regarding the statements by the delegations of the EU, the US, and a number of other countries. Yet again, we've heard a string of insinuations about Russian actions in Ukraine. We'd like to ask them, where are their vaunted principles on human rights protection for each and every person that they're constantly championing? Has anyone once heard them condemn Kiev for attacking civilians? Where are the calls to Zelensky to observe IHL, to not torture or kill prisoners, to not use Western weaponry to fire on civilians, formerly residents of Ukraine? None of them have said a word of sympathy to the loved ones of the hundreds of children who've died at the hands, or who've perished at the hands of Ukrainian troops. They've been silent and they've covered up for the Kiev Nazis ever since 2014. They continue to do so now. In the chamber, delegations from the West have hypocritically mused about the illegitimacy of referendums in the liberated territories. However, their disdain for the plights of their own residents left them no choice. People there no longer want to live in permanent fear of fanatical Ukrainian nationalists. They don't want to jeopardize the future of their children any longer. But their Western mentors couldn't give a damn. It's no coincidence their leaders directly state that for them the main goal is to, at whatever cost, defeat Russia, and they'll stop at nothing to do that. They try to reproach us for the situation inside our country. This lack of principles is no surprise. Only the countries of the EU, the US, and their acolytes think it is possible to lecture other states about life and at the same time, over many months, to methodically stifle all foundations of freedom of expression, restricting and outlawing. It's a good word for Zaprishaya here, outlawing the work of more than 100 media, for example, as in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and Czechia. In this chamber, they tried to criticize our internal legislation on so-called foreign agents. I think I will surprise many of you, maybe even the US, if I tell you that the provisions of our law are in many ways borrowed from the corresponding US law, which has been in force almost 100 years. The difference is that in the US, it's even tougher. For example, a violation can carry a prison sentence of up to 5 years, of which there's no mention in Russia. Australian legislation on activities of foreign agents refer to posts, to messages in social networks, and even musical streaming. Officials from the UK and Estonia periodically let slip their intention to adopt their own law on foreign agents. So maybe it's time for the Council to look closely at this initiative and to send to Washington and Canberra a unambiguous signal of the need to review their internal legislation. On top of all that, you have rampant Russophobia, hate-filled statements and actions, repression against national and linguistic minorities. These phenomena are back and now widespread in contemporary Europe. We are fundamentally opposed to country mandates, but clearly the situation in the EU and overall in the collective West requires the urgent attention of the Council. Thank you. Whew. A lot of good vocab there, a lot of good vocab. Oh. All right, let's have a look at the second one then. This is, I think, for the day after, 28th of September 2022. Statement by Russia, 51st Session Human Rights Council, thematic discourse. I think it was a debate, a thematic debate on the issue of the, I can't remember the exact wording they used, the negative consequences, the negative impact of colonialism on human rights. Again, I would just quickly remind you, always have a couple of good synonyms, just so you're not always saying negative, negative. Adverse is my favourite synonym for negative. Detrimental is another good one. Okay, Mr. President, we think that so распространение знания. Again, fortunately, we had the text for this one, so it gave it gives you had at least a few minutes to try and prepare it. I think, okay, literally, it's the dissemination of knowledge. We think that the spread of knowledge, but I think in English we're more like to say, a growing awareness, growing knowledge, growing awareness of the reasons, consequences, lessons и печальном наследии. Okay, you could say the sad legacy of colonialism. Perhaps in English we talk more about a painful legacy if it's something really negative. The painful legacy of colonialism, важной и актуальной задача. I would almost say here that задача is redundant, is important and relevant. Okay, that saves your word. Remember, again, it's going to be speaking very fast probably. Okay, metropoli. So I think these are my notes. I think I did this statement. I didn't do the right of reply. That was someone else. I prepared it, but then it came right it came much later than I thought it was going to be. So I never actually did it. But I did do this one. So the former Central Powers can сколько угодно, all they like. Now here, because I had the text before, I left that all they like till the end of the sentence. In English we say you can say how great. You can They can say how great they are all they like, and in English we tend to leave that at the end of the sentence. But okay, let's pretend you haven't got the statement, you hear that "сколько угодно," you want to basically render it straight away. You don't want to leave it hanging. So you just, in the way you deliver it, the former colonial powers can all they like. You can almost hear that little pause, okay, that you're making that all they like a sort of subclause within the bigger sentence. Подчеркивать, highlight, stress the civilizing aspects of their colonializing activities. Как бы не оценивались ее результаты, I guess you'd say, whatever you make of the results, whatever you think of the results, бесспорно одно, one thing is for sure. До сегодняшнего дня, to date, to this day, maybe, the countries of Asia and Africa тяжело переживают последствия колониализма. Now, in English, there's a few ways I think we could say this. Maybe we might say they're still coming to terms with the consequences, the aftermath. There's another idea for consequences, impact, the aftermath of colonialism. They're coming to terms with it. Maybe we'd say they're still reeling from. Okay, that's a good. The country's still reeling from the consequences of the earthquake. They're still reeling from the consequences of colonialism. But again, maybe you want to just keep it more simple. So what I went for is wrestling. They're still wrestling with the consequences of colonialism. Wrestling, grappling. Okay, those are two good synonyms. They're very similar in meaning, both physically and figuratively. Are struggling to cope with the consequences of colonialism. Maybe just struggling. Тяжело переживая, struggling with the consequences of colonialism. So you've got a lot of potential ideas there. В этом ряду, so these include, these are important ideas to know, that it's not just the Russians that we'll talk about. A lot of countries that sort of criticize modern day capitalism, predatory exploitation of natural resources. Inflicting, that's an important word to know for нанести, inflicting восполнимый ущерб экологии. I would say irreversible damage to the environment, effectively turning these countries в аграрно-сырьевые придатки нынешних транснациональных корпораций. So what I said was into agrarian resource appendages, придатки, appendages of today's transnational corporations. And последствия, the consequences, the impact of cultural colonialism. That's the other thing that this that refers back to Vietnam Riyadu. But okay, this is tricky stuff here. Effectively turning these countries into agrarian natural resource appendages. If you got a better idea for that, please do put it in the comments. Raw material, that's the other word that for sirevia that came to my mind, raw material. The Russians like these sort of double-barreled adjectives, that I think in English we would use maybe two different setups, or we'd throw in an "and," in between them, but they sort of meld them into one word, like I don't know if you've read Lewis Carroll, maybe when you were younger, or to your kids, Alice in Wonderland Through the Looking Glass. I think he came up with this idea of portmanteau words, of just ramming two words together to make one, like brunch, breakfast and lunch, or smog, smoke and fog. So I mean, this is a kind of portmanteau word, right? And they also have it. What's the one they use for for logistics? They talk about материально-техническая база. That's like logistics. We wouldn't say the material technical. So anyway, that's just one of those little features of the Russian language. So anyway, I thought agrarian natural resource appendages. Произвольное определение государственных границ колонии. This is tricky. So произвольное определение. If you didn't have the text, you maybe my immediate go-to word when I hear произвольное is arbitrary. So I would probably say, okay, arbitrary definition of the state borders of colonies. I think in English, when we talk about that concept, though, of how basically the colonial powers, we talk about how they redrew the map of the world, right, of Europe, the Middle East. We might say the artificial redrawing. I think that's what I said when I did it. The artificial redrawing of the state borders of colonies paved the way for numerous conflicts. So it's tough. You have, if you don't have the statement, you want to just be processing those words pretty much as you go along. So you may say, the arbitrary definition, and you'd probably be okay if you said that, to be honest. I think the Russians would hear that and they'd probably be fine with it. But it's always good to know if you can actually spot the concept almost before it's there, or if you've heard the государственных границ, you normally say, the artificial drawing. It's always good to just have that, have that concept and how you would express that concept in the best English. Заложил основы, paved the way. He's going to use that expression a couple of times for numerous conflicts. Crimes committed or совершенные, committed, perpetrated, okay, synonyms there, good little package. In the colonies, навсегда лишили Европу и США оснований выдвигать претензии. Okay, so again, if you're going through this and you don't have the text, you'd probably say, forever denied Europe and the US any foundation, выдвигать претензии, to claim, to put forward claims. So again, but if you have the text, what's the most natural thing we would say in English? You'd probably say, you can see I put here stripped. Okay, forever stripped Europe and the US. Оснований. Okay, I know it's any grounds. I was initially going to talk about grounds. Strip them of any grounds to claim to. I think we talk about rights, though. That strip them of any right. So yeah, and it just occurred to me. And you know what we say in English? We'd probably say in English if this was just the UK delegation talking, whatever. By committing these crimes, the Europe and the US forfeited any right. That, I think, is the best solution we would say in English. We forfeit the right to be able to say something, to claim something. But the way the syntax is here, I think you'd maybe say stripped Europe and the US of any right or of any grounds. To claim to, now this is important, моральное превосходство и исключительность в международные отношения. These are two important. Okay. So I've actually, you can see what I've written in my notes. I think I'd have said maybe the other way around. Превосходство, I think, is supremacy. That's the word you want for превосходство, supremacy. And исключительность, I think this is a direct dig at, the Americans who always talk about the whole concept of American exceptionalism. Okay, this is certainly not the first time I've heard the Russians have that. The moral supremacy, because you talk about for превосходство, it tends to be racial национальное превосходство, national supremacy, as opposed to exceptionalism. So it's important that maybe to be accurate, to be very precise with those two words. Превосходство, supremacy, исключительность, exceptionalism in international relations. One of the greatest crimes of colonialism was the transatlantic slave trade. Here we go again. Заложившая основу. If you don't want to say pave the way, you say maybe set the stage, which set the stage for racial discrimination, ethnic and religious intolerance, xenophobia, which процветающим сегодня в странах ES и США. My go-to for процветать tends to be to prosper. Again, I think it's just because of that pro at the start. And you could say that, which are prospering today in the countries of the EU and the US. But I think a better word here, as you can see in my notes, which are thriving. I think that's a stronger word almost, which are thriving today in the countries of the EU and the US. It's time to raise the issue of restoring historical justice. Установление ответственности. You say establishing responsibility for the crimes committed, за совершение преступления. Establishing liability is maybe a bit of a liability you always use when someone has done something. It's always used in an exclusively negative context. I think. Responsibilities can be neutral, responsibility for something good or something bad. Liability, I think, is explicitly sort of negative. But I think you could use either here. Establishing liability, establishing responsibility. Speaking of the colonial past, we shouldn't forget, nor should we forget, the contemporary neo-colonialism of the collective West, which is one of the main reasons for uglубление равенства, for deepening inequality. I think you can just directly render the image from the Russian uglубление. I think they talk about deepening inequalities. И разрыв в развитии. Now, I think that's just the gap in development, which again is fine, okay. The gap in development between states in the world today. If you could think of a better thing, though, I was thinking the development divide. So it was one of the main reasons for the deepening equality and the divide in development. We talk about the digital divide, right? That's something you hear a lot. The development divide. I think just the gap seems to be doesn't seem to be strong enough to me. It seems a bit weak. Just the gap. Sort of you get the impression that it's not too much of it. It's only a little gap. There's not too much There's not too much of a difference. If you got a better idea, let me know. Between states of современном мире. If you've watched enough interpretation stations episodes, you will know that whenever I hear of современном мире, I like to say in this day and age. The West is imposing on others, or is foisting, again, two synonyms for навязывать, to foist or to impose on others, its own model of social economic development in foreign policy, and is putting developing states into financial and technological dependence, including through discrimination and sanctions pressure. Again, this is a common leitmotif that the Russians use against the West here, this vision of the world. We have all clearly, for наблюдаем, you can just say see, I guess. We're all clearly seeing human rights colonialism. Because I had, thankfully, a bit of time to prepare, we are all clearly witnessing human rights colonialism. By the way, when you hear право защитные as an adjective, it's just human rights. Don't do anything complicated with it, okay? It's just it's just an adjective just for human rights colonialism. When the West стремятся всеми средствами, does its utmost сохранить свою монополию, to preserve its monopoly, to maintain its monopoly in the field of human rights. I mean, if I was doing this fast, didn't have the text, maybe I would just skip the защита. I would maybe just say it seeks to maintain its monopoly in the field of human rights. If you want, you can put the protection of human rights. Ему сложно смириться с тем фактом. They find it hard to. So I think what I said was that they find it hard to come to terms with the fact that. That's what I think I went for. I said to come to terms with the fact, reconcile themselves with the fact, and that's all great, okay. But that's a lot of words. It's a lot of syllables. Maybe it would be just quicker to say they find it hard to accept that. Смириться с тем фактом. They find it hard to accept that it can no longer в одностороннем порядке, to say unilaterally. Again, just a little pause in your voice gives, it reflects that this is a little subclause, that they can no longer unilaterally establish their own rules, set their own rules. Set's quick to say, isn't it? You set rules. В том числе на правочеловеческом треке, including when it comes to human rights, you could just say, including on the human rights track. I mean, the Russians do like to talk about tracks generally. They use this trek a lot, so you could probably say, including on the human rights track. Maybe in English it sounds more neater to say, including when it comes to human rights. The Western political elites were unable to перестроиться. So I said to regroup, to rebuild. I think regroup in the context is maybe a bit better. Were unable to regroup and viti zone comforta, leave their comfort zone, which long stopped, as you can see here, but which long stopped reflecting modern day realities, contemporary realities. We hope that today's debate or discussion, I think I said here, I think I said will give them food for thought. I think that's, I just sort of thought that sounded better. I suppose you could say that today's debate will enhance their understanding. Maybe that's, I mean, again, if without the text, and if you heard that coming out that way, would enhance their understanding of this. But I thought, food will give them food for thought. I think was that a bit of a risk? Maybe a slight risk. Maybe there's always a slight danger that the delegation might say, "Oi, Mr. Interpretation Station." I didn't say that, but they didn't. They were all right. Okay, let me just whiz through this then as a quick sight translation. President, we think that growing awareness of the reasons, impact, lessons, and painful legacy of colonialism is important and relevant. The former colonial powers can, all they like, highlight the civilizing aspects of their colonizing activities. Whatever you think of the results, one thing's for sure. Even today, the countries of Asia and Africa are struggling with the impact of colonialism. This includes the predatory exploitation of natural resources, inflicting irreversible damage on the environment, effectively turning these countries into agrarian raw mineral appendages of current transnational corporations. And there's the impact of cultural colonialism. The artificial redrawing of state borders of colonies set the stage for numerous conflicts, crimes perpetrated in the colonies, forever stripped Europe and the US of any right to claim their own moral supremacy or exceptionalism in international relations. One of the gravest crimes of colonialism was the transatlantic slave trade, which paved the way, set the stage for racial discrimination, ethnic, religious intolerance, xenophobia, which thrive today in the EU and the US. Maybe you can just drop the Stranach in the EU and the US. It's high time to raise the issue of restoring historical justice and establishing liability for crimes committed. Speaking of the colonial past, we shouldn't also forget the modern colonialism of the collective West, which is one of the main reasons behind deepening inequality and the development divide between states in this day and age. The West imposes on others its own models of social and economic development and foreign policy, and places developing states in financial and technological dependence, including through discrimination and sanctions pressure. We're all clearly witnessing human rights colonialism when the West does its utmost to preserve its monopoly on human rights. They can't accept that it can no longer unilaterally set its own rules, including when it comes to human rights. The Western political elites were unable to regroup and leave their comfort zone, which long ago stopped reflecting contemporary realities. We trust, Nadim, so we trust that today's discussion will give them some food for thought, will enhance their understanding. I thank you. And I thank you. So guys, if you've learned some any useful new words, if you like some of the ideas that I've given you, please do tell me in the comments. If you've got your own ideas, also tell me in the comments. Smash the like button, keep subscribing, sharing with your friends. I'm starting my new sort of series. I'm doing YouTube quick 1-minute shorts. I'm going to be doing more of those. And that's about it. I'm being called for lunch. It's 1:30. Come on, you can let me go. Done a pretty good job for you today, I think. Which leaves me with nothing more to say other than that episode 147 of the Interpretation Station stands adjourned.
Interpretation Station. We hope you enjoyed your visit. Until next time, folks.